So we're in your United States history book. We're in chapter 27 now, section 4, Latin America and Africa during the Cold War. So we're going to go into Puerto Rico as a new territory, onto unrest in communist Cuba. We're going to talk about what the Bay of Pigs, the controversy of the Bay of Pigs, onto the Panama Canal Zone, Africa, the conflict in the Congo in Africa, apartheid in South Africa. So this is covering quite a bit. You can see here now how the Cold War was affecting the world, especially now in the United States. And we see here Fidel Castro, that basically he's holding hands with communist leader Khrushchev, and communism coming very, very close to the United States now. So let's begin. Third world countries. So third world countries. I know I was reading, someone says that's an old, outdated term. And it might be an old, outdated term now because the Cold War is not as it was before. But what are third world countries? So they were usually countries that were not aligning with communist countries, and were not aligning with the United States. So during the Cold War, countries in Latin America and Africa aligned with neither side. They didn't take sides on either. They weren't on with communism. They weren't on with freedom. They were considered third world countries. Both the Soviet Union and the United States worked to gain their support of these third world countries, undecided countries, really. So when you think of third world countries, I always think, oh, that's a backwards term. You label a third world country, you think of poverty and chaos in the country. And a lot of times there was a lot of chaos going on. But basically, third world countries mean that they they were neutral, when it came to either communism, and they were usually new countries that were recently coming into independence. So the Soviet government used the social unrest in third world countries as a pretext to offer Soviet aid and to promote communism and anti-Americanism. The United States sought to promote capitalism and the sense of freedom within these countries. So those are two different ideologies we're talking about. We're talking about now communism and free will countries, or freedom countries, or capitalistic countries. So two bases of government. So, and that's what the Cold War has been about, So we see here the Soviet way, the Soviet government and communism. The way they promote communism in other countries is to go in and get them all involved in some type of social unrest, whether it be war or hatred or racism. They use a lot of different methods basically to get these countries so chaotic that they need a dictator to come in and take over, in which they do. So this is a big tactic as a pretext to offer Soviet aid. We'll come in and help you now. You guys need help. And so they run to these dictators and end up in a worse state sometimes than they were before. So here's the guerrilla warfare happening there, as you see. Here's communist leaders in these countries. You can see this actually is in Poland, when Poland came out of, the behind the Iron Curtain, so to say, came out of communism. So we're going to start off kind of with a good story, the story of Puerto Rico, a new territory. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, that's a long time before, United States gained the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico. But not until after World War II, in the 1940s, did Puerto Rico become an organized territory. So in 1917, the Jones Act granted the people there American citizenship. The council was replaced by a popularity elected Senate. They elected their own senators. And then in 1947, the Puerto Ricans were granted the right to elect their own governor. So in 1952, Puerto Rico became a self-governor commonwealth of the United States. So what does that mean, a commonwealth? It means commonwealth means that we will protect it. They're under our protection, under the protection of the United States of America. So here we have the story of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's success they called as Operation Bootstrap. Helping them pull themselves up by their bootstraps is what that meant. So new health and sanitation measures, education, public works projects, provided employment and improved the lives of the people. So we brought in new health, sanitation, education, public works, employment, all these things to help the Puerto Ricans pull themselves up economically. And not only that, there was a lot of missionaries that went there too and brought in the gospel. In 1940s, the government of Puerto Rico launched Operation Bootstrap, a campaign to increase industrial output. Several oil refineries were constructed there, creating many new jobs. American tourists helped to expand their economy, as you can see there. So here we have the plan for outside investment and industrialization to boost Puerto Rico's economy. So this is Operation Bootstrap in Puerto Rico. And it had a good report. But in the meantime, there was a lot of unrest in Latin America. Nixon basically decided to do a goodwill tour during his administration. You see here he's going on the goodwill tour. It says, despite vast sources of undeveloped natural resources, Latin America remained economically, politically, and socially backward. So having all kinds of unrest in Latin America. And they had a lot of resources. We have a lot of different natural resources in Latin America. These conditions caused anti-American sentiments. Many believed they deserved greater share of United States foreign aid. So Vice President Nixon then visited in May of 1958 on a goodwill tour, and they were very hostile to him. There were hostile demonstrations against him in Peru and Uruguay both. The hostility escalated in Caracas, Venezuela, when Nixon's motorcade was attacked, breaking his windows of his car. So this is during Nixon. This is actually when he was vice president under Eisenhower. So here in he's visiting, and basically as he's visiting here, May of 1958 is actually when I was born. Anyway, he's visiting these countries, and they are not really behind America in many areas, and not really behind the President Eisenhower and Nixon, as you can see. Communist Cuba and Fidel Castro. Here's a picture of Castro. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista lived 1901 to 1973, and he became the dictator of Cuba. Cuba prospered economically under his rule with close ties to the United States. We'd helped Cuba after the Spanish-American War. We were involved with the Cubans, and then we had been behind Batista. Even though Batista, I'm going to say, he lived here a picture very wealthy life compared to how many of the Cubans were living in abject poverty. So he was so there basically was the rich were very rich, few rich, and the poor. There was a lot of people that were poor at this time. But the help of America coming in still to Cuba was great. So Fidel Castro, 1926 to 216, that's when he lived, all the way to 2016. I said 2016. Attempted to start a revolution against the government by attacking the army barracks in Santiago in Cuba on July 26, 1953. So here we have an uprising. We have Fidel Castro, deciding, that he wants to raise up. And looking at, when he looked like a freedom fighter. He looked like he was going to stand up, against, the wealthy, stand up and bring help to the poverty in Cuba. That's what he looked like. He and his followers were captured and then they were imprisoned. And so in 1953, he was captured and put in prison when he started this revolution. So then he was released from prison in 1955, and he organized the 26th of July movement in Mexico. It was named after his aborted attempt to seize Cuba. So now he's starting a revolution not only in Cuba, but now in Mexico. So he's very much a revolutionist, right? And you think revolutionist, is it revolutionist, or is he a communist? Or is he being promoted to do this? And we'll find out. It'll all come out in the end, won't it? So Castro's bearded face and tattered uniform would become familiar to Americans in succeeding decades. So we are very familiar. You'll become very familiar. So here's Batista in Cuba, and you can see how they are living very wealthy, in the presidency of Cuba. And of course, that wasn't the case with most Cubans. Castro's guerrilla warfare. On December 1956, Castro and his followers waged unrelenting guerrilla warfare. Then on January 1st, 1959, the Batista government had totally collapsed. Batista fled the country, and Castro rode triumphantly into Havana, capital of Cuba. But the Cubans, they cheered him. You can see he's cheering. Everything's great. He says he's a freedom fighter, and now he's taking over. He's going to take over the government, and everyone's cheering. But the Cuban people soon discovered that they had merely changed one dictator for another dictator. Castro, though he was hailed as a freedom fighter, soon showed his true colors. He transformed Cuba into a communist dictatorship. Thousands of people were executed or imprisoned after mock trials. $1 billion in American-owned property and businesses were seized. He seized all the businesses. And so Castro then met with Khrushchev, the communist leader in the Soviet Union, Russia, in 1960. At this United Nations meeting, you can see him holding hands with Khrushchev, and they embraced each other as comrades. Like, oh, Fidel Castro, you did a good job taking over Cuba, is what it looked like. America responds to the Cuban crisis. So Eisenhower responded to Castro's anti-American actions by barring Cuban imports and foods and medicines. So basically, okay, now we're going to have to, we got to do something here. So he thought economically he'd bar food and medicines from going in, which wasn't the best way, but that's what we had to do something. Just before Eisenhower left office in January 1961, the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba. So on April 3rd, 1961, the United States Department of State made a final plea to Castro to disassociate from international Marxism. So basically they're saying, Castro, you need to get rid of this international Marxism. You need to sever your ties from the Soviet Union, right? Is what they're telling him. Here's some pictures of Fidel Castro. You can see as a leader in communism. The Bay of Pigs. You're really wondering what this is about, huh? Bay of Pigs? Well, the Bay of Pigs is the bay, Cuban Bay here of Havana, right here. So, of Havana Bay. Here's basically the island of Guantanamo Bay right down here. So, April 17th, an America-trained force of about 1,600 exiled Cuban freedom fighters invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. So these are considered few freedom fighters now, and that's what they thought that Castro was. But President Kennedy had promised these liberators air cover and support, but little aid was given to them. So the invasion was brutally crushed. Most of the exiles were returned to the United States at the end of 1962 for a ransom of $53 million. And they actually, through this, they compromised and brought in $53 million of food and medicine. The Bay of Pigs, was President Kennedy's greatest embarrassment, because Kennedy actually had come in with Americans and had trained these freedom fighters to overthrow the communist government, and told them that he was going to, provide for air cover and cover them and protect them, which he didn't do. And so basically these fighters, if they got involved, they were easily taken by the Castro communist government at that time. And many of them were either crushed, put to death, or they were used as a ransom. So, ugly thing. In fact, like I said, it was President Kennedy's greatest embarrassment as president. Pictures of what was going on. Bay of Pigs, not a good thing. So then came, under President Kennedy, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So everything's focusing now on Cuba. Why? Because the Soviet Union is using Cuba, or wants to use Cuba as their port to put missiles pointed at our country, since Cuba is right south of Florida. So, September 2nd, 1962, the Soviet Union announced supplies of Russian arms and technical specialists that would be sent to Cuba for defense against American imperialism. So basically saying, we're going to get rid of these American imperialists, they called them, as they're trying to take over these countries, looking from the communist eyes. So in October 26, Kennedy appeared on television to announce a United States naval quarantine of Cuba, as Cuba had installed offensive missiles and bomber bases on the island directed at the United States. There's a picture of missile. The missiles now were directed, nuclear missiles directed at the United States. Oh my goodness. So now the whole world stood on the brink of nuclear war, thinking, if the Soviets do fire nuclear weapons on the United States will fire nuclear weapons on them, and we may not even have a planet anymore. Our whole world may be destroyed. So President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev on October 28 met so they could end the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets pledged to halt the construction on the missile bases in Cuba and remove their weapons under the control of the United Nations supervision. And the United States agreed to end the quarantine and not invade Cuba. So on November 20th, Kennedy announced the end of the blockade and to withdraw their jet bombers as the Soviets dismantled their missile bases. So turned out good, even though now the crisis was still there politically, but now everyone knew the United States was not going to put up with the Soviets' missiles pointed directly at our mainland, right? So here's the picture. Here's Kennedy trying to work through this whole thing. You can imagine the anxiety in doing that. Here's Castro and Khrushchev giving him a hug. Brother. So on to another area, the Panama Canal Zone. And we're going on to a new president, President Jimmy Carter, and his treaty. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter negotiated to surrender American control of the Panama Canal Zone. He was going to say, okay, we're going to let Panama have the Panama Canal Zone that's located in their country. He believed the doing would quell anti-American violence in Panama. So he was trying to say, oh, this is a good thing to do. And remember, Jimmy Carter did a lot of things basically thinking, oh, people are basically good. Well, to find out that terrorists and communist countries and these dictators, they are not. They do not have good intentions. The Hay-Bunal-Varilla Treaty had awarded permanent lease to the United States in exchange for supporting Panama's independence. So we had at least permanent lease the United States to control the Panama Canal, to keep everything, in order there, and also to keep the terrorism out of the Panama Canal so that ships could go through easily. So the Panamanian governments had tried to convince the United States to end this lease, thinking they wanted it. Now they want their canal, considering it in their country, right? So Carter's decision was very controversial because the Panama's government was under a hostile dictatorship. He was trying to appease them. Appeasement never works. He was trying to appease the dictator by saying, okay, we'll give you the Panama Canal. So Carter was criticized because the turnover of such a crucial strategic canal that was built and paid for by Americans could be seen as to the communists as weakness. So basically they're saying, you know what, communists can come in, take over Panama. They're going to take over the Panama Canal, thinking they were weak, that we're giving up our canal that we built and paid for there. Then in 1979, Congress ratified Carter's treaty to gradually turn the canal zone to Panama, gradually. As a result, terrorist guerrilla groups increased their activities not only in Panama, but also in the neighboring countries of El Salvador and Nicaragua. So all kinds of mess was going on down there. So not a really good idea, do you think, at this time? Considering to appease terrorists never work. The appeasement of terrorism never works. And so, anyway, not a good thing for Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter. On to Africa. The conflict in the Congo was going. So let's jump over to another continent. We're going to be talking about Africa. So by 1960, the former Belgian Congo was embroiled in the Cold War. So again, communism was coming into these countries in Africa. The Belgians had never prepared the Congolese for self-government. The Belgians actually, the Belgian Congo, they had come in and, they had dealt with the people there, but they never taught the people how to govern themselves. Let's just say that. So Congo then became the Republic of the Congo, calling them Democratic Republic of the Congo today, but back then it was called the Republic of the Congo. On June 30th, 1960, civil war broke out as soon as they declared the Republic of the Congo. The Soviet Union sent technical assistance and supplies, of course, to aid the pro-Soviet premier, Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba, at that time, was looking towards communist leaders to provide for him. So the Belgians had also sent troops, and the United Nations had sent a peacekeeping force to try to keep peace in the Congo. The conflicts were just escalating out of control. So the violence and unrest continued to flare up following the assassination of the deposed Lumumba in January of 1961. So we have another assassination happening. The Katanga province succeeded. So we have all kinds of unrest in Congo. Not only their leader was pro-Soviet, he is taken out. We don't know if the United States was involved in that, or not. But in 1961, he was assassinated. Lumumba was his name. Lumumba was assassinated. So we see here what's going on in the Congo. Oh my goodness, you see very primitive people, these primitive people here in the midst of total chaos in the Congo. Marxist terror in the Congo, missionaries murdered. So in 1964, The Marxist, that's communist, supported the terrorists and instituted a bloodbath that was reminiscent of the atrocities committed by Stalin, Hitler, and Mao Zedong. So horrific things were being done in the Congo. Thousands of Congolese were executed. In the city of Stanleyville, a town in the very center of Africa, the African continent, there were 2,000 Americans and Europeans, and most of them were missionaries, and they were taken hostage. When the United States Air Force planes then dropped 600 Belgian paratroopers into Stanleyville to rescue the hostages, the mission was protested by the communist leaders in the Soviet Union, China, and Africa, thinking, what are you doing? Oh my goodness, we have our people there taken hostage. But anyway, minutes before the paratroopers landed, nearly 30 hostages were murdered, including an American medical missionary, Dr. Paul E. Carlson. He lived 1928 to 1964. 80 Europeans and Americans were killed by the communists. Dr. Carlson, before his death, prior to this, said, "In this century, more people have died for Jesus Christ than have died in the early centuries, which we think as the days of the martyrs." Basically, before he was martyred himself, he said, we're having martyrs, people being martyred and dying for the Christ all over here in Africa, more than possibly other decades. He's seeing a lot of Christians being killed in Africa, especially in the Congo. But here is a picture of the doctor, Dr. Paul Carlson, and his missionary family, loving on the people there, of course. And in the midst of this, he too was killed. He was taken hostage, and he was killed and martyred. He's a martyr for Christ. The last we're going to talk about is apartheid in South Africa. So this is during the Carter administration. Jimmy Carter, from 1977 to 1981, built much of his foreign policy on the concept of human rights. And of course, apartheid, considering is segregating, the segregation that was going on in South Africa. In doing so, though, Carter, he failed to recognize the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian governments. That was a big thing, that he thought he could just treat dictators as if they had good intentions, and they didn't. So often he refused to support friends of America who had been forced to adopt authoritarian means to fight communist insurrections. The Carter administration condemned many communist-led countries and even United States allies for the human rights records, and often withheld aid to those countries. Carter cooperated with the United Nations and consistently condemned the government of South Africa because he disagreed with the apartheid policy of racial segregation. So what this is all saying is that we know racial segregation that was going on there, between the blacks and whites in South Africa was horrific. We know that. But instead, he was giving support to the communists that were in charge. And basically, they were going to use the racial problems that were going on. They were going to use them in order to take over, and possess as a communist dictator, totalitarian government. So Jimmy Carter was looking at, okay, we're against this segregation here, which is right, but he also gave support, to the communist government that was forming there by doing this. So it's kind of crazy, but that's how it went. Communism or apartheid. Carter's policies were ineffective. They didn't work. So the government of South Africa was less interested in preserving racial segregation and more concerned at this time with fighting communist terrorists. So that's what they were. They were like, okay, we have these communist terrorists come over. Communists want to take over. We have guerrilla fighters, all this unrest. Basically, that's what communism do. Because communist Soviet Union and such were sending those, to stir everything up in the racial scene and everything, to make everything terrible so that they can just say, okay, now we'll come in and we'll fix it. That's what they were doing. That's how they work, The communist terrorists used apartheid as an excuse to incite a revolution. Apartheid was wrong. It was wrong. Segregation is wrong. But Carter's unwillingness to work with an otherwise strong ally in the fight against communism ultimately hurt the fight against apartheid. Because when the communists came in, they could care less about what was going on with apartheid. They just wanted to take over. And in taking over, they would actually massacre tons of people. And that was the history. That's what happened. Often Carter's well-meaning efforts resulted in the overthrow and replacement of anti-communist countries with communist dictators that were anti-American and even more oppressive. See that? They came in. Basically, he said, "Well, I'm against South Africa because they have they're having racial problems of apartheid, and so we didn't help them in any way. But their biggest problem wasn't that. Their biggest problem was that they were actually in the process of being turned over into a communist dictatorship." Meanwhile, Carter's diplomatic efforts to promote human rights in communist states were ineffective. Unlike old regimes, they received an aid from other communists and therefore felt no pressure. So basically what that's saying is that when the United States did not help, then of course communism would be able to come in under the disguise of whatever social unrest was going on. So here we have the apartheid going on and basically going out of control. And then we have a communist dictator coming in and taking over South Africa. So it's the way it went in a lot of other countries too, I'm telling you. So that's about it. So we'll go on to the next. We're going to focus on the Middle East.